No one country, not even the US, which is the biggest economy, or China in the world right now, can go on without collaboration. And I think that is something that the GCC countries have all the right prerequisites. It's now a matter of executing, and I think we're lagging on execution, not necessarily on collaborating on paper. It's a matter of execution now.
Tejarah Talks.
Hi, I'm Shabib Al Maamari, and welcome to Tejarah Talks, Oman's premier business podcast. Today, we're joined by His Highness Dr. Adham Sayyid, co-founder of the firm, and Dr. Mohab Al Hinai, Vice President, Sustainability and Circular Economy at BIA. Welcome both to the podcast.
Over the past 10 years, Nodal has worked on some of Oman's most important digital transformation projects, including the InvestEasy portal and the Omani Census 2020. We've also been committed to developing local entrepreneurial talent through our Oman Talent Hub. With digital transformation playing a key role in Oman's Vision 2040, we're excited to see what's next for the country and how we can continue to be part of its journey.
We'll be speaking about regional collaboration today, and if I may start with you, Dr. Adham. And the question is, how do you define regional collaboration in a way that feels real rather than theoretical?
Well, when we think of regional collaboration, the word regional obviously creates a geographical imprint in our mind. We're going beyond local borders. And perhaps being an economist, one of the first things that always pings my attention has been economic collaborations, or what we call today regional blocks, FTAs, economic agreements. And those are just different ways of looking at formal engagements between jurisdictions, such as countries, such as regions within a country as well, especially larger countries like the US, Russia, Australia, and even China. And those kind of collaborations set rules of games in formal and informal ways. And they kind of kickstart a domino effect that starts with sort of larger, broader objectives such as economic integration and whatnot, and kind of cascade into people's lives, whether it's culture, whether it's travel, whether it's investment, or even education, research. So there are many different aspects when we talk about regional collaborations. We often think of the bilaterals, but the regional collaborations brings a bigger group to the table that are generally looking to achieve something. There is a common denominator, and that common denominator drives the story. And that's where the challenges always come, because there is changeable factors that may very well sway these regional collaborations. We see today that those regional collaborations are being rearranged due to geopolitics, due to economic interests, technological changes that are changing the emphasis and the locus of regional collaborations, whether it's from west moving on to the east, or whether it's from the north moving down to the south as well.
Amazing. Would you like to pick on that, Dr.
Yeah, sure. I agree with what His Highness said. If you look at a lot of the collaboration across our region has been going on for a few decades now, since the establishment of the Gulf Cooperation Council. But a lot of the topics that are urgent to address, for example, the waste, water, resources, these things do not adhere to any borders. Pollution, emissions, these things are cross-border. They don't, look at the border, for example, crossing from here to Saudi or UAE. They don't look like, oh, I'm going to stop, this is my limit. No, they are cross-cutting. And I think there's a urgent need now to really start collaborating. And we need to move beyond the MOUs and to really execution. We need to execute on these projects, on these and capitalize on the region's capital and the underutilized talent.
Would you say that your area is now ripe for regional collaboration in your field?
I mean, yes, there is a lot of my expertise at BIA is circular economy and sustainability, and I think that the term circular economy has been coined maybe 10 or 20 years ago. It's a fairly new concept, but it really is at the core of the economic diversification efforts that all the 6 GCC countries, which is resource efficiency, energy transition, economic prosperity. So I would say yes, but obviously my opinion is a bit biased. But I think, Oman, if you take a step back and look at Oman, we're really leading on that front. I think that the Ministry of Economy has already launched a circular economy roadmap or a framework that's going to be concluded by the end of the year. And I think a lot of other GCC countries are going to follow suit. So I would say yes. That's the short version of the answer, if you want.
Great. Dr. Adham, is there a recent partnership or initiative that has genuinely stood out for you?
Oh, that's a challenging question, because I couldn't think of any regional collaboration that did not start with someone's great idea, not only in our region, but in the broader sense beyond. But I believe closer to our region, having studied it closely, the GCC is always close to heart, because that's what really impacts myself personally and any person living in the region when we travel cross borders and when we decide whether we move to work in one of the neighboring countries and we decide to. The reason is because the region presents an interesting anomaly where cultural, historical ties tend to make it quite obvious to have a regional collaboration, but economic challenges, geopolitics have always presented a challenge. We live in a region that, is always living in paradox one way or the other between trying to make all of these alignments. But what we fail to capture is the amount of integration that we've had. And this is not just economic integration, although that faces its own challenges, but in the like-mindedness of institutions in many instances, in the unexpected outcomes that we haven't planned for, whether it is VC capital moving its way across borders without questions of nationality or even, allegiances, where we've seen opportunities present themselves for youth that were not present, say, in our generation previously, whether it's in education, investment, work, or travel. And I believe many of these barriers are being shifted because they still exist one way or the other. So the GCC to me presents a very unique opportunity to provide solutions that are quite different and unique. Having said that, though, I often look at other regions, perhaps not as well developed, that have challenged our model. We often look at the EU, but we fail to see in East Africa, for example, there are many very, very interesting examples of integration well beyond our own expectations, whether they're in payment systems, whether in trade. Arguably, these have been enabled by external investments. However, the impact on the locals and people's livelihoods has been dramatically different. While still competing for the bigger economic pie, it presented very interesting cases where you're looking at travel times cut by almost 75% in certain places from the East Coast to the inner countries, where you're looking at the cost of transshipment, for example, from one region to the other, cut by 60% in some cases for a typical container. Those are the numbers we're looking for when we talk about regions that are able to invest in infrastructure. Muscat to Riyadh, Riyadh to Kuwait, to Jeddah, to Salalah. That infrastructure exists today in our region, but how well we're taking advantage of that, this is where I find this quite interesting. We have the means, but how do we achieve the results we look for?
Just to build on that, Your Highness, how do you navigate the tension between the national priorities and the benefits of moving forward together?
That's always been a bit of a challenge for our region because of sovereignty, but we do have unique value propositions that are quite similar in the region. And I believe our visions are competing with each other, whether it's Vision Oman 2040, in Saudi Vision 2030, and in the rest of the region. But I believe there's always been that common sense at the higher levels of leadership to see some collaborations working effectively. Now, where I find the difficult maze that we have to kind of find our way around is how to convince our institutions how to work together better, how competition needs to be co-opetition, as someone might call it. Now, arguably, some might say that doesn't work very well because we're all want to be the logistical hub, the AI hub today, and the hub for tourism, financial services. But we fail to see it as strength in numbers and size. And I believe that argument is critically important. So the more sort of transnational or supranational institutions we create that are effective, that's going to alleviate some of that pressure on the competition. This is where we borrow from the EU in the way it works. But we should be mindful that these are 6 unique countries looking to place themselves on the world map and to benefit their citizens in the first instance, but to be able to take advantage of the opportunities presented between each other.
Dr. Mohab, what small practical adjustments could help countries in the region work more fluidly across borders?
Okay, so like His Highness mentioned, a lot of the initiatives, they always get maybe delayed or not executed because everybody's always looking inwards, and that is fine. Each country can look at its sovereignty and its priorities. However, where areas where you can collaborate, for example, in Oman, the decarbonization, the economic diversification, these are things that, yes, they constitute national sovereignty, but you can lead on these issues when you collaborate with other countries across the border. And His Highness mentioned, the EU bloc, but also there's the ASEAN countries. There's a lot of, collaboration across these countries. And the GCC countries, if you look at the 6 GCC countries, our population combined is maybe 30 to 40 million people. So if you only look at each country individually, we might not have the population or the density needed to drive a lot of these initiatives. But if you take it as a basket, then you have more weight, more resources, more capital that you can deploy. And, we're seeing a lot of these in the past few years. We're seeing a lot of these investment funds that are, 2 countries joint fund, for example, Oman and Saudi Arabia, Oman and UAE, Oman and even now Algeria are having an investment fund. So these cross-border collaborations are very important to drive a lot of the same problems or challenges that our countries are facing. Capital can be pooled. We have a lot of capital in the area that can be pooled, and a lot of institutions are calling the region now, the funding capital of the world, the GCC countries. We have a lot of underutilized talent, and people sometimes forget that the population of the GCC countries is very, very young, very energetic, but highly educated. So I believe we can, build on that, and we can, address a lot of these challenges in a collaborative manner, not necessarily in silos.
How can the private sector, I would say, add momentum to cross-border partnerships?
The private sector can lead. So governments by nature, all governments in the world, are a little bit slower to move. There's a lot of bureaucracy in governments, whether in GCC or in Europe or in the US or Australia. There's a lot of bureaucracy. However, the private sector can lead by forming these cross-border commercial entities or businesses and looking at it from a commercial perspective, from an economic perspective, working through the challenges, ironing out all these challenges. Once that is done, governments tend to follow. So I believe the private sector can lead and the government will naturally follow suit.
A question for you both. Would you like
just
to
before we actually get to that, I want to challenge that a little bit, because each regional collaboration has its own dynamics. And we've seen, for example, the example of ASEAN in certain Southeast Asian countries, it was the private sector that led these informal collaborations cross-border, where, for example, Malaysia would come very close to Singapore, and there would be natural kind of flow of goods and people and investments. While in our region, it's been traditionally states that lead these collaborations, and businesses sort of benefit from them. So if you take the example of the electrical grids in the GCC as a very solid example of successful regional collaboration projects, where electricity could come from Kuwait all the way to Muscat or all the way to Riyadh, and connecting that kind of common infrastructure, that is largely led by government investments and state-owned enterprises. That these are very capital-intensive kind of industries. And this is where we need to be mindful, where the private actors can make a difference, and they can, mobilizing capital investment and whatnot, but it still relies heavily on states to make the first move, to lay down the infrastructure necessary to enable that. So our expectations of private actors and private sector investments should be sort of thought in tandem with those government-led and state-led investments as we see across the region.
I think it works really well when it comes hand in hand. In our case, I would say tourism, we're waiting for the Schengen GCC to go live. That would help the private sector, and I think government would benefit at the end of the day. Would you like to reflect on that? Or
see, one of the things is the fact that you've called it Schengen is in itself, to me, a bit of a copy and paste kind of mindset that we need to be mindful. What is our ultimate goal? We have local population in the tens of millions, and then we've got tens of millions of expat population.
True.
And we know that the local GCC population, or the native population as one might brand it, can move very freely across the region, using your national identity cards and whatnot. But there's a lot of restriction on the more flexible sort of human capital that could move more easily. Now, such visas do not necessarily address those issues, while we've made it easier for expats living in GCC to move. But we're trying to mimic a model that does not necessarily work very well for our region. I believe it does have its positives, I think, but how do we manage the differences in screening, for example? How do we manage to have, much like our customs union, people come into Muscat and want to go into, say, Abu Dhabi? Will they be stopped at the airport to be screened again after they've already received? Or, as the Schengen system works right now in Europe, some countries might abstain from providing access. And that is a right, again, a sovereign right. So we need to weigh that against the fact that what would happen to the concentration of tourism services within the region, where some countries are able to capture and take advantage? It's not a dispute issue, but much like the customs union, the question is, the 5% goes to whom? The same thing happens. What if I have at the lack of any better sort of example, the Thomas Cook example of, dominating an industry for some time? Will that be in Muscat? Will that be in Abu Dhabi? Will that be in Riyadh? And how would the other services? So I think there's going to be a lot of tug and pull, while we need to weigh the cons and the pros and the cons for what we think might come out of this.
Amazing. Question for you both. Which emerging technologies do you see opening the door to new forms of regional cooperation?
I'll give you that one first.
Well, I think, like I mentioned, decarbonization, circular economy, energy efficiency and energy transition. But also, I think, digital MRVs, for ESG and verifications. Obviously, the digital economy is very big. These are all things that the region can lead on. They're fairly new technologies, fairly new concepts, and I think we have an opportunity there with our population, with the talent that is being I believe is being underutilized, to capitalize on these areas.
Dr.
I think we couldn't say two words without saying AI.
Yeah.
But I'm mindful that AI is an enabler in many cases, but we don't see enough use cases today. But if we were to sort of collaborate on placing AI at the center of our problem solving, whether it's the climate responses, adaptation, but also creating opportunities for the talent and youth Dr. Mohab had mentioned as well. And I think with AI comes a whole set of other technologies that are enabled. So as we're moving on towards a digital economy, a true digital economy, not just e-commerce, but actually creating value, payment systems that cater for our needs, citizen interactions that are led by, what an Estonia example would be, the 4-click model, those kind of things, that there's not one particular emerging technology that will be the game changer, but we need to be mindful that all of these emerging technologies need to solve our sort of challenges and problems. AI is going to be at the forefront because it's going to enable us to do things faster, potentially better, hopefully more efficiently, but ultimately, will it make us all more productive? Being service-based economies within the region, there is great value in using such emerging technologies. But let's not forget that manufacturing needs to have robotics. Manufacturing needs to have sort of climate-friendly energy. And those technologies need to catch up, whether they're in solar or wind, whether we're talking about microgrids. That is what's going to keep this engine going. And without that type of sort of those emerging technologies, or existing, let's not call them emerging anymore, how do we utilize them in the region? On the payment systems, we know that recently some countries in the GCC have managed to use digital currencies, central bank digital currencies, as modes of payments and transfers. We're looking at a region that exports a lot of capital through remittances to other countries. How are we going to change that? How are those fintech technologies or financial technologies going to impact the way we do business, the way we trade with each other? Again, let me fall back on the African example, where people, whether they're fishermen in agriculture or any other field, could transfer using basic phones, not even smartphones between their accounts or between themselves and payment systems. And here we're talking about availability of fintech, buy now, pay later that has moved into the region, emergency loans for individuals provided by telcos today. There is a whole new dynamic on enabling people to spend less time on the dreary tasks and focus more on being creative and innovative. How do we bring that to the table? Not in Oman, not in the UAE, not in Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or Qatar or Bahrain, but within the GCC region and beyond.
Maybe just to add, you need three things to move a project or a initiative. You need regulation, which really gives you the rules of the game, right? Like His Highness mentioned, technology, which is an enabling, it gets you where you need to go. But then the most important thing is finance. And if you don't have the finance or the capital, you can have hundreds of pages of regulation. You can list down, tens of technologies that you can use. But the most important element, in my opinion, is capital. How you attract finance and the capital to get all of these projects off the ground. And I think we have no shortage of capital in the region. And it's a matter of how do you deploy it and where do you deploy it.
Absolutely.
Great. Dr. Mohab, if you had the chance to champion one fresh regional initiative tomorrow, which direction would you take?
Well, for me, it will definitely be the circular economy initiatives. So if we look at from a global perspective, there is every year the global economy utilizes over 100 billion tons of raw material every year, whether it's biomass, fossil fuels, ores, non-metal ores. All these go into the global economy on a yearly basis. 50% of these get stuck in stocks, buildings, long-term infrastructure. And 40% or more than 40% ends up as waste or emissions, and less than 7% gets recycled and goes back into the industrial ecosystem. Obviously, this is not sustainable. 100 billion tons every year. It is like we are stealing from our kids and our grandkids. So this is where the concept of circular economy came up, and we're working with a Dutch-based, not-for-profit organization that is very popular in the circular economy front to help with setting up our roadmaps, our frameworks. So globally, the global economy is less than 7% circular, and that's fine. Nobody's asking people to move to 100% circular economy. That is not very pragmatic, that's not very realistic, and it's not achievable. But what if we move the needle by 1 or 2%? How much economic value can this unlock? Some say between $500 billion to $3 trillion, US dollar of economic value can be unleashed by just moving the needle slightly, maybe to 12% or 10% circular economy. So how much of that cake can Oman and the region take in terms of high-skilled job in this field, whether it's in AI and robotics and resource efficiency? A lot of estimates say up to 20 million high-skilled jobs in this field can be created. Again, now you look at from Oman's perspective, how many of these jobs, how many of these talents can we attract in Oman to set up these new industries, these new ecosystems? So at BIA, what we think of, collaboration is enabling us. We know where we want to go, but how do we get there? And not a single country or a single company can get there without collaborating with other entities in the region. So we work, for example, closely with ISWA, which is the International Solid Waste Association. That is the authority when it comes to waste management and resource management around the world. We have established a regional chapter formed here in the region. It is based now in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. Oman is a founding member, UAE is a founding member, and Saudi Arabia is a founding member. And the aim of that is basically how can we pool our collective knowledge and our collective experience to drive where we want to go, which is circular economy, decarbonization, energy efficiency. And these are all things that, like His Highness mentioned earlier, Oman Vision 2040, Oman Vision 2030, the UAE Vision. All of these, if you look at them, they all say the same thing: economic prosperity, education, health. And these are things that we really can collaborate on while keeping, our national identity and our national sovereignty.
Your Highness, would you like to pick on?
And there's a lot of things I'd love to pick on, but I think one of the things that obviously crosses my mind is that the geopolitics have basically shifted our mindset about collaboration, whether it's across regions or within the regions as well. So the word protectionism would not be the only way you describe the model that is happening today. But what we're finding is the bilateral models are beginning to surface more as countries are looking for one-to-one collaborations, sort of in economics jargon, it's the South developing countries with the North developed countries. But more so, the countries are beginning to weigh in with their economic might to sway different collaborations one way or the other. We see investments leading the way into these conversations prior to striking economic agreements. But I think everyone is soul searching to what would work today. Now, economic blocs, regional collaborations are still quite strong, whether it's the GCC, the EU, the East African community, or South American, Mercosur, ASEAN obviously in the East, are all looking for answers. But we've got countries forming things like BRICS, which is looking for different solutions to detangle from traditional relationships that no longer work anymore. But it isn't the economic relationships alone. We're looking at multi-layered collaborations. If we think in the broader sense, all countries around the world, almost all of them, are signatories to the SDGs. And in the very last goal, collaborations is in the heart of the story. And how do we achieve our economic, social, and environmental targets? Our climate targets, whether in Oman or everywhere else, depend on collaboration. So Oman's national declaration for adaptation plans depends highly on those collaborations, financial collaborations, investments that would help Oman mitigate some of the sort of heavier emissions that are more difficult to mitigate, whether it is our transition towards that target as well. And it is just the environment. We're looking at cultural collaborations underlining many of the sort of intricacies of softer diplomacy. And this has played a larger role. So if we look at Oman, for example, much of our collaboration with many countries has an underlying effect of discussing our experience and sharing our cultural experiences, whether it's in the recent expo in Japan, or whether it's in our collaborations in the arts and sort of the Benalis of the world, whether in Italy more recently. Oman has been using those tools to collaborate, to build on historical ties as well, and sort of bring in those collaborations that will build later on economic, political, security, climate, and circular economy, and many other aspects. So I think, to me, there isn't one particular model that comes to mind as much as more flexible models that are able to build on existing partnerships and draw in on others. And I don't believe there's a one-size-fits-all in the story. And I believe countries like Oman and the broader region, the GCC, will be constantly asked to change that model between East and West, self-dependency, or interdependency within the countries, and being independent from other players. But there's no taking away that heavyweights like the EU are going to influence how we collaborate between blocs, and whether we're able to leverage on some of the opportunities that we have as well.
Yeah, maybe I just wanted to add, I was watching a video the other day, I think, of a famous economist, I think in the 80s or 70s, and he was holding a pencil in his hand, and he was talking about collaboration. He's like, think of this pencil. Not a single country or a single company can you manufacture this pencil. Think of where the wood came from, where the paint came from, where the metal piece around the rubber came from, where did the rubber come from, where did the lead come from. Probably 5 or 6 countries. The resources from 5 or 6 countries were pooled to make this pencil. But if you also look at the machinery that made the pencil, where was it manufactured? And so I think collaboration is important. It's vital. No one country, not even the U.S., which is the biggest economy, or China in the world right now, can, go on without collaboration. And I think that is something that the GCC countries have all the right prerequisites. It's now a matter of executing, and I think we're lagging on execution, not necessarily on collaborating on paper. It's a matter of execution now.
So, for the audience watching us today, what would be your final takeaway, I would say, the summary that you would like the audience to take away from our talk today?
I think, having gone through so many different angles of what we mean by collaboration, we need to be mindful that collaboration is not set in stone. It is definitely going to change. So having that flexibility, having the sort of insight and the farsight to look into the future and think what could position those collaborations into more fruitful benefits, not simply for yourself, but for those who you want to work with as a country, as a business, as governments as well. So I think really the takeaway for me is always going to be the flexibility and the ability to adapt to change using those collaborations.
Excellent. Dr. Mohab.
Yeah, I think from me, it's be as transformation throughout the years, and how we started off and how we've been evolving into a circular economy and a resource management company, and we have been getting recognition from from ISWA, the International Solid Association, the Circular Economy Foundation, that the things that we have been doing at VIA and at Oman, a lot of these entities, when countries go to them, asking for advice, they're like, oh, we have one great example. Look at what Oman has been doing, transforming this sector, resource management sector. So this is something that we really need to be proud of and build on. So collaboration only enables us to really strengthen and consolidate what we have right now, and that is something that I truly believe in.
It's been an absolute pleasure hosting you both. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Shukran, Shabib.
Joining us today were His Highness Dr. Adham Sayyid and Dr. Mohab Al Hinai. And that wraps up another episode of Tejarah Talks. I'm Shabib Al Maamari. Please don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast platform and join us again next time. Until then, stay curious.
Tejarah Talks.